Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're going to get started here very quick or shortly. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes and see if we can get some more of our participants. In the meantime, if you want to say hi to each other, tell us where you're from in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Got lots of people from all over the place. Thank you for joining us. I think we'll give it just one more minute. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us for another Collections Stewardship webinar. Today we'll be hearing about collection inventories, tips, tricks, and making it to the finish line. I'm Caitlin Potus, and I'm the Secretary-elect of the Collections Stewardship of AAM. And I'm also the Registrar at Mingay International Museum in San Diego, California. Thank you again for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Christa, if you'll go to the next slide for me. This is a webinar, so you can see us, the presenters, but we can't see you. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. And if you, again, keep telling us where you're from, say hi, that's great. Use that chat feature. I'll be monitoring the chat if any questions do end up in there, but please do try to use the Q&A portion if you have questions for the presenters. This webinar is being recorded and we will share it out on the CSAAM website as well as our YouTube channel. And I'll send out those links to everyone on the listserv when those videos are ready. If you have any Zoom issues, you can use that support link, or you can send me an email directly. I'll try to keep an eye on that as well. Otherwise, be sure to look out for the recorded video at the end. So I'll introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Christa Barleben from the Eiteljorg Museum of American Indians and Western Art. She is the registrar there. And then Linda Endersby, who's the registrar and curator of collections at the Museum of Art and Archaeology at the University of Missouri. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christa to get us started.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to talk about the inventory that we recently did at the Eiteljorg Museum of American Indians and Western Art. And so to get us started, I just will show a little snapshot of who we are. The Eiteljorg Museum is located in Indianapolis. We have about 9,000 objects in the collection. Our collection mostly focuses on artwork that depicts the American West, contemporary Native American art, and customary Native American art. We have 8 galleries, which is a little over 32,000 square feet. We have 6 galleries that are dedicated to the permanent collection and 2 rotating changing exhibition galleries. We also have a small outdoor garden space, and our collection storage area consists of 4 storage rooms. That's just over 7,000 square feet. Our main storage vault is where we house the entire permanent collection, but we also have 3 smaller temporary collection storage rooms, which we use for other uses. We have a staff of about 4 full-time collection staff members, and our collections management is TMS database. And I really wanted to get this all out there because when we're talking about inventories, this is everything that we had to deal with and work with when we conducted our inventory. So just knowing these types of stats helps us plan and get everything done that we need to do. So first off, I want to talk about a little bit of how we prepared for our inventory that we did last year. We actually started planning for our inventory about 1 year out. So we started planning for a full collections inventory in 2019. We started planning meetings just to kind of get everything on the same page. And I know this may sound silly, but one of the first things we all did is we looked at our calendars. And we made sure we booked 6 full weeks for the full collections inventory on our museum shared Outlook calendar. So that meant the entire staff and the entire building knew that for 6 weeks, we would be out of commission and we couldn't do any other projects. And doing this a year out just made sure that we didn't have any other projects that would stack up on top of it, though we knew some things would probably pop up along the way. We determined 6 weeks because we decided that we could do 4 teams of 2 people each. And this would be with the assistance for our curators, volunteers, and interns. So since we have 4 full-time collections staff members, it would be 1 person with each staff member of our collections team. Another thing we really wanted to do while prepping for the inventory is we have 1 temporary storage space, as you can see in this picture, that's kind of a catch-all room for us. It held a lot of temporary holds and items that were non-accessioned at the time that we have been tracking in Excel spreadsheets and other documents, and they had not been incorporated into TMS. And so we really wanted to make sure we got a good grip on those. And so over the year, our collections manager worked with our interns and they entered in over 1,000 records from that room into TMS. So that way, when we did inventory, we could inventory that entire room accurately as well. So as the year went on, we kept on having planning meetings and we really started to finalize our plans about 1 to 3 months out from start. So we are looking at the end of 2019 when we were really starting to get things pulled together. One of the things we really wanted to do was make sure we had all the supplies that we need. So we reviewed our collection supplies and ordered some additional supplies. One of our big pushes that we wanted to do with this inventory was we realized a lot of our hanging tags had disappeared over time or they got separated. And so we really wanted to make sure that all the objects had a written number on them and they had a hanging tag as well for ease of access to look at objects. So one of the big things we ordered was lots and lots of hanging tags. We also made sure all of our technology was good and up to date and that we were able to access the database on our laptops and had a good access point with that throughout the museum. We also took this time to have kind of short mini meetings just to kind of make sure we reviewed the plan, our timetable, kind of what type of points we wanted to make sure we had to make sure we are still along the same pace because 6 weeks is very intense and we knew that we had a lot to do. And also we just went through what was the standard for inventorying. So we were planning to do a two-step verification, which I'll talk about later. And so we wanted to make sure everybody was on top of the two-step verification and that we are entering the inventory correctly, both in our database and on the paper records that we are having. So if you caught on, I said we were planning all of this in 2019 for a 2020 renovation, or sorry, inventory. So COVID hit, and we were planning to do our inventory 6 weeks in between April and May. So like all of you, we were shut down and at home with stay-at-home orders from March to the end of May. At the end of May, Indianapolis was allowed to ease restrictions a little bit, and people were allowed to start going back to work just a little bit on rotating schedules based on the need. We had a long talk with our administration and our VP of operations, who was heading up our COVID response. And he said that we could come back into the building if we wanted to do this inventory still. And we were very, very motivated to get this done. And we decided at that point, yes, we still wanted to come into the building. Yes, we still want to get the inventory done. And so we completely revamped our entire inventory strategy. We decided that we knew we weren't going to have any additional help from staff or interns and volunteers, and that safety and safety protocols were the utmost importance. And so instead of 4 teams, we went to 2 teams. So we had team 1 and team 2, so 2 collection staff. Team 1 was our collections manager and our collections assistant, and team 2 consisted of the registrar, myself, and our director of museum collections. We made sure too that we didn't have any overlap in our schedule when we were doing this. Each team only worked 2 full days. So team 1 worked Monday, Tuesday, team 2 worked Wednesday, Thursday, and we left Friday open for other things that needed to get done. We started this inventory about the end of May, approximately when we got everything figured out, and we went from a 6-week inventory. So with COVID safety precautions, we actually turned it around in 7 months. So our new strategy modified. We had a completely different strategy going into this. We had 4 teams that we were going to break the entire galleries, temporary storage, main storage, and outdoor gardens into. But instead, we had to break it down into 2 teams. And I know this looks really kind of uneven. We had team 1 who was working on Mondays and Tuesdays. They went straight into our main storage area, the vaults, and they started working on the Native American customary collection, which actually contains about 80% of our entire collection. So it was a big bulk of what we need to inventory out of the 9,000 objects. And team 2 took care of smaller areas. So we took care of the 1st and 2nd floor galleries, which was actually very easy to do because at this time the museum was still closed to the public. We didn't reopen until the end of June. So we are able to do some things in the galleries as well as we are doing inventory. From the galleries, we then moved into main storage, and we moved to the other side of main storage. I'll show you a picture here in a moment. And we worked on hanging racks and flat storage, which contained most of our 2D collection. Once we got that side of the storage room done, which was the smaller 20% side of this main storage room, we moved over into our temporary storage areas, which were 3 smaller rooms that had the temporary holds in them. And then on a very nice day, we decided to go outside and do the gardens, which has about 6 or 7 bronzes outside. And actually, sorry, let me say that. 7 bronzes outside with a loan. So it was a good strategy, and it worked out really well for us, kind of dividing these items up. So here is our storage in the main room, our main vault. The image on the right shows our customary Native American collection, which is on the rolling racks, palletized with the shelves. And you can see that it's much denser because there's lots of boxes with lots of items in it. So it is very much 80% of the collection. While on the left side, we have the hanging racks, which just contain, paintings and drawings on one or other side. So it's much smaller area to inventory. So like I said earlier, we actually had a 2-step verification process. The first step was in TMS, and I pulled up our TMS screen here. This is TC Canon collector number 2 self-portrait. It's one of my favorites. We inventoried it through location, and so we did a physical inventory location. Here you can see on the screen the date. I was person number 1, if you want to say, and I was physically having my eyes on the artwork. So I confirmed its physical location. Allison Evans, my supervisor, the director of museum collections, was running TMS that day, so she was approving the inventory and me physically seeing the painting, and then the transaction was complete. So this was how we did an inventory inside TMS. So then after we completed that inventory check, you can see here in location history that it now does say July 16th that we did an inventory location and that TC Canon was in the vaults on R21 left. So that was really great when we had TMS. There were some areas where we were lacking in Wi-Fi and we could not access the database. So we also had a second step verification, and this was also very nice because we could see what we were looking at for that entire section. So what we did is every morning we printed off about 5 or 6 locations that we knew we were going to inventory. So this is the front page of R21 where that TC Canon was located at. And we print off a location with image. And that way Allison had it sitting right next to her at the computer. And when I would see the artwork or the object, I'd call out the number. She would verify in TMS with the first verification method that we just did. And then as you can see on this sheet, she would actually check it off, initial it, date it. And if by chance we are in an area that we had no connection to TMS, this would be our first verification. And then we would go back downstairs and we would read the numbers off again to verify in TMS. So the second, so you can actually see the T next to the image means that it's also been verified in TMS. On top, then we wrote completed, the date we completed and who it was by. We also, this was great if we had any notes that we needed to take. If there was an object that was not listed on this list, we would turn it on the back side and then just start a new list. This was basically a great handheld object that we had a physical written inventory completion as well. So if you notice in the first picture I showed you, and I'll show you another picture, we also had a full inventory form, and these were great little sheets that we stuck to the end of every rack, every pallet, every drawer, every cabinet, just to show that it had been done and that you can move on, you didn't have to do it again. This was really great, for motivation, because you could just see the progress that we were getting done over the 7 months because the yellow sheets just kept getting longer and longer. But also it helped us kind of get a quick spot check on an area if there was an issue. So let me just go through this form really quick so you guys can understand everything. There's the 3 boxes on top. So if R21 was completed, then we'd hit complete. If there was an issue, we would mark it with an issue and then list the issue below. We list the date that the rack or shelf was done, completed by. Staff member number 1 would be the person reading off the object numbers. That would be me normally. And then staff member number 2 is who was doing TMS entry for the day, so who was verifying it in TMS. And then if there's an issue, so for example, if something wasn't located there, or if we found something that was located but wasn't recorded there, that's where we would write those issues. Some issues resolve themselves later in the day. So for example, if there's a painting on R21 left, but it was actually listed as being on R21 right, we would find that in the next step over, and we could then go back and then mark resolved, and by the date it was resolved and who it was resolved by. Some took a little bit longer to resolve, and some we're actually still working on figuring out. So I actually have a full one completed here so you guys can see. I actually have this, I was trying to stick with R21 left for the entire presentation, but R21 left was boring because it was a complete non-issue rack. So I grabbed R22 left, which is the next rack over. It was completed by us on the 16th. I was the first staff member. My initials were reading off as the person who was reading off numbers. Allison was the second person who was entering and confirming on the sheet. And then you can see we had an issue. 2016.19.1 was not there, but it was in TMS as being on this rack. But we actually located it later that day on R18 left, and you can see we made the note, found R18 left, TMS updated, Allison updated it, and she updated it on the 16th. So here, this is what vault looked like with all the yellow sheets all over the place. And so we had them on the end of every rack here, on every shelf, on every drawer. It just gave us a great check. That's done, what's not done, what issues do we need to resolve, and keep going with that. So we had the ability during COVID to really take the time, since we had done this inventory now in 7 months instead of 6 months, to do some additional minor little projects while we were inventorying to kind of help us out overall. Team 1 was, again, in the Native American customary collection section of our vault. And they were actually confirming signatures on pottery and artwork as they were inventorying things and updated anything that might be wrong in TMS. For artist-wise, they're also looking for any additional signatures and marks that might not have been recorded in TMS, and just taking that little extra step while we are inventorying, which kind of helped us out along the way. They were also working with a storage note worksheet, which our collections manager created. And she had a list of kind of like a quick checklist of things that we needed to note on storage. So if we pulled out a box and maybe something had failed in the box, or if the object needed to be adjusted somehow, those storage worksheets were then just made quick notes. So she has a full list now that she needs to go back and review and fix. And those little things too are kind of helping us along the way. For our side, for Team 2, we had a huge push many years ago to make sure we had photography of everything in our collection. And we do have 95% of the collection photographed in some way, even if it's just a quick snapshot, to make sure we have that physical reference in the database. So our big push was when we were in the galleries and working on the racks and the flat drawers with a lot of drawings and objects that needed to stay in the dark, was to make sure we had a snapshot of the image in TMS. If we are missing images, our phones are so great now. I was able just to take a quick snapshot with my phone, and then I processed them later to make sure we had that quick JPEG image in TMS for future reference. And we are also at the same time checking and verifying signatures on artwork as well. So what's next? What's the next big push that we need to do? As you can see, this is a pile of all the paper inventory sheets that we have and that we are really kind of combing through. So right now I am pulling together all the yellow sheets off of all of the shelves and off of all of the places in the vault, and I'm sitting in front of TMS and I'm reconciling any of those outstanding issues and making sure all those issues have been resolved. We are still working on this. We had hoped to get it done a little bit sooner, but it's something that's definitely still in progress for us. Our plan is next, after the issues have been resolved, is to run a search in TMS and see if any objects were not inventoried and to locate these objects, because we want to make sure our inventory is complete. We also found out that we had some component issues in TMS, and that not all of our records in TMS that have components were up to the current component standards that we have. And so our collection manager is going through that, and we'll be updating components in TMS that objects have and making sure they're up to date with our standards that we have in our CMP. We also have a couple very large installation pieces, and we noticed that some of the numbering standards were not complete for all of those. And so we're going to go back and make sure we have those numbered correctly as well, and that those are up to date with our standards. And most importantly, we've updated our CMP policy and procedures for inventories, including yearly spot checks of the collection, which is something that's really important. So we'll be doing spot checks this year as well, even though we just completed the inventory last year. So I was really happy with everything that we were able to complete. This was the first full inventory that I've ever done. I've done smaller ones, but nothing to this scale. And it was really a learning experience. And I hope that you guys got a lot out of it too. So I know we have questions at the end, but thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Linda.
Hello. If Christa can stop sharing. There we go. And hopefully I can get mine up. So, so you can see that. Hello, and welcome again. I will say some of the things I'm going to go through, I may be a little quicker about because Christa talked about them in more detail. So I may make some changes on the fly. And mine is less of a case study and more some general tips and tricks. I've done multiple inventories at multiple institutions, different types of collections and different levels or scopes. And so I've published and I've done some training and different stuff. So I'm going to go through some more, as I said, general tips and tricks rather than just one specific case study. Now, if I can get that to actually go through. So I wanted to highlight just a few things that I think are important in actually getting to the finish line. One is flexibility, because things like COVID can happen. But I do want to say, in most circumstances, if it's a more full inventory and things, and you can't just print lists and check them off, that you are talking months and potentially years. So with that long of a stretch of time, the likelihood that something is going to interrupt, something is going to change what's going on is high. So you should keep that flexibility in mind, sort of at the top. And as you noted from Christa, preparation. A number of years ago, somebody gave me this quote that I love, which is the easiest part of doing a collections inventory is doing the inventory. You want to spend as much time as you need on the preparation, because then that makes the inventory more accurate, more consistent, and easy. Did I mention flexibility? I have this formula that I use for a lot of things in museums. There's cost, time, and quality. You can't have all three. You can have two of the three, unless you happen to be the people who have tons of money. And if you have tons of money, then you can do this collections inventory with whatever time schedule and as deep as you want. But most of us aren't in that way. I believe heavily in Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong. And then another thing Christa also mentioned is like weekly team meetings, communication. Scheduling stuff in for that is really, really important as you go along through the process. Oh, and of course, there's flexibility. And I'll talk a little bit about why I emphasize flexibility. If there are any of there out there that worry, that are still concerned about why, actually a Collections Stewardship, along with the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists, just revised the Code of Ethics and Professional Practices for Collections Professionals. It just got released in March 2021. And there's a great quote from there that tells you exactly why you need to be able to provide current information on each object, its location, status, and condition. And that's an inventory. You need to make some decisions up front. Again, I mentioned cost, time, and quality or depth. You need to pick two. You can't have all three. For most of us, we need to save time on cost, which means this isn't necessarily going to get done quickly. Or if it has to be done quickly, then it's not going to be in as much depth or as much quality or scope as you might like. There are some decisions about workstations and workspace I'll talk about. And then for some of us, it's a question on where and how to start. And so these are some of those key decisions right up front. Whoops, sorry. About where to start. Okay, so workspaces. You have to make a decision and think about, are you bringing objects to staff or you're bringing the staff to the objects? Not all of us have the luxury of having our galleries closed and being able to do what we want in the galleries like Christa had. So here's an image. Actually, at one point in time, we're set up in an exhibit gallery and doing it in the gallery where we've got parts of it roped off so that we can do that because we can't bring those objects to the staff. And some of this is dependent on the layout where you're at. For some collections areas, you don't have room to put the staff in the room with the collections. And in that case, you don't necessarily have a choice. You have to bring the items out and then prepare a good enough space where you can bring the collections to. And you may do some of each, but that's one of the key decisions about workspaces. The other one is sort of paper or electronic. And some of that is related to cost. If cost is not an object, or if you have a grant, the image in the upper right is a really nice mobile workstation that I know I never got to use that on the inventory, but somebody else had that, and they had a couple of mobile stations, and those stations moved throughout the collections area and kept people moving through that, and they were able to enter things directly into their database. On the lower right, you've got an iPad with an attached keyboard, which can also be useful. But again, if you're talking an inventory where it's months, that can sometimes get uncomfortable and inconvenient. So you have to think about it. Another thing about the paper, and Christa sort of hinted at this, is if you're writing things down on paper and then going back and entering or checking, there is almost a second step of verification and a paper backup to what you're doing for the inventory that can be helpful in some ways. Where you actually start sort of depends on the condition of your collection. And that means not just the physical objects, but the condition of the information in your database, the condition of the object files, the session files that you have. On the left, this is an image from one collection that we essentially were doing from scratch. In many ways, we didn't know what we had or where it was. In that case, we essentially had to start from the physical locations. In the middle, that was one that I did that was somewhere in between, where a lot of what we had in the database was fairly good, but we knew we had some unprocessed. We knew we had some found in collections. The image on the right is actually from the museum I'm at now, and actually a fairly decent inventory was done not that long ago in 2013. So what's in the database is fairly good, and it's a different process. We certainly, in this case, when we're planning the inventory for this year, we start with printouts direct from the database, because in most cases, you're just saying, yep, that's in the box. Yep, that's on the shelf. Yep, that's in the cabinet, marking it off, signing it, and dating it. And that's a whole different situation than what we were at for the image on the left. And some of you may have wondered why I had that high voltage sign at the beginning and wondered how it was relevant. In the case of that, for one of the collections areas that we were inventorying, you did have to walk through a door that said danger, high voltage. You walked past the transformer for the building, which is in that second image. And we shared the building with other people. It was not just our building. And then you see somebody standing in a doorway sort of at the back. That walking through that doorway is where some of the collections that we had to inventory were at. For some of that space, our inventory techs actually wore masks and gloves and got fairly filthy. And the image on the right is actually an image from behind the transformers. So we actually had some objects stored back in there. So that was one where we had poor conditions. We really were first starting from scratch. And this is partially a story to say, no matter how bad it is, you can do it, because we did. And it was all a matter of, in essence, planning from the beginning, even though we didn't always know what we were going to get into. And a key part of this is scope. Now, for a basic inventory, essentially the things you have to do is the object ID, where it's at, who inventoried it, and the date inventory. Those are sort of the basic things that if you're doing an inventory, you need to do those things. And now, depending upon time and cost, those other two, the three, depends on how deep, how much of a scope you can do. And I think there's already a question in there. It's like, do you do a full condition assessment or not? Do you take a high quality photo or just sort of an identifying one? And those are things you really need to talk about ahead of time, because all of that affects how long it's going to take. You usually have a limit on time. In terms of that one where we're sort of starting from scratch, there was a huge discussion about quality photos. And in the end, as you know, Christa was talking about, we did these quick snapshot identification images because the high quality photography was going to make it so that we didn't get to the finish line. And that's part of what a lot of I'm talking about here is a completed inventory that has a smaller scope is better than an inventory with a big scope that is never completed. The key thing here is figuring out what you need to do to get the inventory finished. And so that's where a lot of what I'm talking about is coming from. So keeping with that analogy, so now you're at the starting line, you're getting into your stance. Three ways to look at it are your procedures, your forms, and I would urge a pilot project or a test. And these aren't necessarily in any specific order. The thing that has worked best for me, and I've heard from others that it works well, is you like draft a set of procedures, you draft some forms, and then you pilot them. You know, you do a shelf or two, you do a cabinet or two, using those procedures, using those forms, and then go back and make revisions. Something that's worked well in a few cases is if you have interns coming in who don't know your collection, have them work using the procedures, using the forms, and inventory a shelf or inventory a cabinet. Watch what they do right, what they do wrong, and how you need to change the procedures, how you need to change the forms to make it successful before you do the full inventory. And some of this depends on who you have doing the inventory. And if you're on your own, I feel sorry for you, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. In many cases, as with one Christa talked about, you'll have multiple teams working in different areas or on different things. In a lot of cases, although, you know, with Christa, they used all internal staff. And a lot of inventories that I've been a part of, we brought additional people in who didn't know our collection. I mean, they knew how to handle collections, but they didn't know our collection. They didn't know our museum. They were there for a part of this project. If you get grant funding, that's often what you do, is to pay people. And the things like the procedures and the forms become extremely important to keep communication and consistency among those different teams. And you saw Christa had examples of some forms, but I would really, really urge test before you start the full inventory. Do some pilot projects as part of this. This is just an example of one form that I've used on an inventory, and it does sort of have the basics: date, object number, in this case a description, because remember, we're not going from printed lists. Location, some unresolved problems. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Staff, the image, and in this case, the image was, I took a basic image. As Christa said, phones can take great basic images for identification. And then in some ways, this form sets out some of the procedure is after you do all of that, a next step is to check the accession file. A next step is to check the catalog cards. In that case, we had all kinds of catalog cards that in some cases, that was the only place that some of the information was, even though we had a computerized database that had been used for 10 years. And then that last one is, it was put into Past Perfect, which is the database we used. And I've got a couple other sample forms in here. And if, by the way, anybody wants like a copy of the PowerPoint so they can get some of these forms, email me and I'm happy to pass them on. Where I'm at now, as I said, our collection and locations in our database is in fairly good shape. So when I was planning the inventory for here, we're going to be able to print out these lists. And the basic would have been, you go down, yes, check this drawing is in this box, check initial date, and go down the list. Because that was going to be so quick, this is when we decided in terms of scope that we could add a few more things in. For example, we know that for some of our artwork in antiquities, we only have black and white images. We don't even have a low resolution in color. So we're going to have that as a part of this process. Again, not necessarily publication quality images, but at least a basic color image of an artwork. So for example, you could tell, was it really just in black and white or was it color and we didn't have a color image? Some more full condition assessment, or at least marking this should be checked for possible conservation, mark something if it needs to be referred to a curator for possible deaccession. So we had set out the scope that was going to include some of these other things. Since planning, a few things have changed. As we start the inventory this month, we will be down to essentially the basics, where we'll print out this form, we'll say, yep, that's in here, check mark, initials, and date. I'll explain a little bit about why that is, but I'm big into flexibility now. The next couple things are just different examples of procedures, and you don't need to see all the detail. If you want to, contact me. But some of this is, if you've got written procedures, they need to be very specific, step by step. For that inventory that I was a part of, where we're essentially starting from scratch, we were lucky enough to get a grant. We hired some temporary people in. We were actually creative because our organization at the time was part of a larger one, and it was almost impossible to hire many full-time benefit eligible staff. But we were also in a smaller town, more rural, where it would be hard to get part-time people in the area that, you know, were doing other things and had the qualifications. So we had to be creative. We managed to be able to hire in people for 6 months full-time. So especially graduate students, there are all kinds of them out there. Some of them use it to fulfill internship requirements. They could get an apartment. So they moved to our town, stayed there for 6 months, worked full-time, 40 hours a week. But that means that every 6 months, we were changing inventory teams. And so our procedures in terms of what had to be written down and communication between teams became essential. I will say an added benefit to that one was at the end of that, we had, I think, like 8 temporary staff who had worked on this, and they were exceptionally well trained in terms of collections handling and everything. And they ended up all going out, and they're gainfully employed, at least before COVID, in full-time collections positions. And so there was an added benefit to professional development that we ended up making what I consider a great contribution to sort of the future of the field. And that was sort of with us being creative about solutions. So I try to think of that, turning lemons into lemonade. Sometimes it works. So I'll go through a few of these. Another thing that you want to think about in terms of procedures, especially if you're not going with a database that has a lot of things already filled in, is part of that prep should be setting data standards, especially if you have a lot of people working on teams. And again, especially if they aren't people who at least work for your museum and have some familiarity. Hopefully, maybe you already have these. But if you don't, this is a good time to think of this so that these multiple teams, when they're doing data entry, are giving you consistency within the database. Because we all know it's hard to have a database where everything is consistent in terms of search terms and in terms of the way you title and all of that. So this is a good time to try to take care of some of that, and not necessarily going back and fixing everything that's in the database already, but making sure that what you're doing during the inventory and from that point forward does have some consistency. And these are just, in one case, we had a huge number of Pacific Island shells that nobody really knew anything about. So we had somebody who knew something about them give us the set procedures so that they could at least put some of the basics in as part of the inventory. So we had a separate procedures for how to pick what categories the shells should go in. We had a different thing for lithics so that you didn't depend on these temporary tech inventory people having that knowledge, and yet they could get good information into your database. During the race, don't be afraid of changing midstream. I mean, the Eiteljorg did that, although they hadn't quite started the inventory. I've known circumstances where you've planned 2 years for an inventory, you're year in, and you've only inventoried 20% of the collection. Well, you're not going to get the rest of it done necessarily in that following year, so you may have to change the scope. Not get as much information for that second year as you did for the first. So that's, again, where that flexibility comes in. Weekly meetings, that was key for this start from scratch inventory. And Christa mentioned, you know, even when you're putting those tags up and it can make you feel good, celebrate those good times, you know. Bring in cookies if you completed a room, you know, something. Mark those milestones as you go through this process. Keep the data and report it to everybody who will listen. And I would also urge that that includes the public. You know, these days, even if you're putting stuff on Instagram or Facebook, one we had, well, this one where we started from scratch, in the midst of it, actually, we were told, oh yeah, if you move your entire collection in the next 6 months, they can be in better conditions. And we were only partway through the inventory. But we used that in terms of moving the collections and the inventory to actually, we finish inventory in a room, move it to the new space, and we would actually have public tours come in. I mean, small groups, limited, but that ended up actually forming a friends group for the museum that's still with that museum and does fundraising and things for them. So don't sell short the communication with the public. And this is actually one case in the bottom right. There's a picture of people from our inventory team but there was a museum about 30 minutes away that was going to be doing an inventory. So they brought their staff down and inventoried with us for a few days as part of a training process. So I have done that. You get extra bodies, but then somebody else also has an idea of how to do these things. Some of these things, Chris just talked about some of them, but here she had those yellow tags, here are red tags, marked shelf complete, box complete, cabinet complete. This is along the same line as what Christa talked about. I do want to talk about something that I think is important in terms of keeping the flow of the inventory going. As you're doing this, you're always going to run into problems. And what I found helpful is, especially if you've got other people who've come in to help you with the inventory, is never slow them down by problems. If you come across a problem, whether it's a problem object or something else, find a way to mark it. In one case, we had a problem cabinet where we had objects that couldn't stay where they were because they were going to interfere with the inventory. We didn't know what to do with them, so they got put in the problem cabinet. All of those problem things got put aside, and then either when there was time during the inventory or after, I think Christa talked about some of these, those were dealt with then, but it didn't stop the flow of the inventory. I did want to mention grants, Institute of Museum and Library Services, Museums for America. I've gotten grants from them. I know other people who've gotten grants for them. And in many cases, while there's some supplies, it's often for the staff that you need. I was going to talk a little bit about the situation I'm in now, but I think I'm going to skip that for now. And if somebody really wants to know, I'll talk to you about it later. I did want to mention a few resources. There's a book that came out recently, Managing Previously Unmanaged Collections by Angela Kipp. If you're almost starting from scratch, that's a great book. In March, there was actually a webinar done by the Texas Historical Commission Museum Services that was a case study of another of an inventory done at the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas. If you want more examples, if you want to see again what other people have done, that's a great webinar. There is a chapter in Museum Registration Methods that talks about inventories. So there are resources out there. And Christa talked some about what comes after. So I will leave that for now. I would say, once you finish the inventory, you're back at the starting line. You need to plan to do regular inventories and how to keep that up so that people don't get back in a situation where it's really hard to do the inventories. So thank you. I hope we gave you some useful information. I think we've got some time left for some questions. So I will pass it back off to Caitlin.
Great. Thank you so much, Christa and Linda, for sharing your experience and all of your tips and tricks. That was fantastic. So Linda, based on your last comment, somebody asked, how often should you plan to do a full inventory, and vice versa, how often should you do spot check inventories?
Some of it depends on your collection and what's doable and how thorough your inventory was. If you get to a point where it's fairly good and the inventories that you're doing are just saying, yes, that's still in the box, yes, that's still on the shelf and going down. What I found helpful is once you've done the full inventory, schedule what you're going to do for each year. So like if you're going to inventory it once every 10 years, which was in some ways sort of a standard, then plan what 20% you're going to do in the first 2 years, what 20% you're going to do in years 3 to 4, so that you're not doing it all at once. You're going, but over the course of 10 years, you will have gone all the way through the collection, or this year we're going to do all the paintings. Next year we're going to do the prints and drawings. Next year we're going to do the antiquities, but make it as even as possible as you go year to year. I mean, it would be great if we could do it once every 5 years, but that's not always possible. In most cases, it's good if you can do maybe every 6 months, do some random spot checks and audits and have it done by somebody who's not on your collections team, who comes in and they pull a record from the database and go see if it's on the shelf or it's supposed to be, or go to his shelf and say, okay, here's this object. If I go pull it in the database, is it like that? So if you can, I would try to do those once every 6 months. Some of it depends on how many people are touching the collections. If you have a lot of people who have access and able to move them, then you might want to do this stuff more than if you have only 1 or 2 people who can actually move things.
That's a good point. I know I have curators who like to go in and move things. I think we all do. Christa, did you have anything to add for that question?
No, I think Linda is spot on. We're still working on updating some of our policies and procedures to have this written down on when you should do these things. But no, we're aiming for about the same thing and get some spot checks done yearly if possible. So yeah.
Another question is in regard to the paper list that you use. How long do you need to keep those physical printouts after everything has been consolidated into your database? Emma has inventory sheets from the past few decades of inventories at this point.
For me, it sort of depends. If it was a problem inventory and you still have unresolved problems from those, then I might keep them around. If you've done the inventory and you've resolved issues from that paper inventory, then I don't know that I would keep them from a couple decades ago. But that I wouldn't get rid of them until you know you have a full inventory that's completed and problems have been resolved. Because if they aren't resolved, they may still be in that paperwork.
Yeah, I know for us, we do plan to keep these files for a while, make sure they're filed away. We've lost some paper inventories and we're trying to piece some things together. And so we want to make sure we have a really good record. But yeah, it really depends. I think if you have that full inventory, like Linda said, decades might be a little too much. So.
Great. And so both of you have different databases that you use at your museums. Is there one in particular, or do both of yours have specific portals or abilities for inventory purposes?
TMS does. It's in location module and it's set up specifically so you can do an inventory check. Linda, what about Past Perfect?
I've used Past Perfect before, and they had, as part of the location, they had a place where you can check inventory and put inventory information. Where I currently am, we use Argus, and actually we had to program to add that. But one thing I like about Argus, with my background, we actually have some flexibility in changing things. So it wasn't that hard for us to work with Lucidia to create that. It didn't come as part of it, but it wasn't that hard to create it. But if your CMS doesn't do it, find a way to get that into the database. You want to have a record in the database of what's been inventoried when. So find a way to get it in there if it's not a standard part of the CMS.
Have either of you worked with barcode inventory systems, and is it worth implementing if you have?
I have not. I don't have any experience actually with barcodes.
I have not, although I have a really good friend who's done it. So I can, if you have questions on that, I could get you in touch with her. She's at a place where they essentially have like 5 different museums, all the way from a firearms museum to an art museum. And So it was it's multiple collections and complex, and for them, the barcoding has saved them. I think for smaller collections, sort of the cost and the time may not be worth it. But like I said, if you want to do that and you have questions, I know somebody to get you in touch with who knows a lot about it, but I haven't done it.
I've worked with barcodes in a different form. It was more for a collection move, but we can use it as an inventory system. But we didn't barcode at an object level, we barcoded at a container level. So you scan the barcode and it will bring up all of the objects that are in that container or in that box or on that pallet. And that definitely has saved us a lot of time and energy. But as far as doing it for inventory purposes specifically and at the object level, I'm afraid I don't have good information about that. But Hannah just said that let's see.
Yeah, the Buffalo Bill Center.
The Buffalo Bill Center did barcode.
That's where my friend is at, Greta Russell, and she could talk to you a lot about that.
Great. So it sounds like barcoding is a good method. So we're just about out of time. Let's see. Tiffany wonders if you have any recommendations how to do a full inventory with one collection staff member when you're not able to set aside a couple weeks or months to focus only on the inventory. Any suggestions?
Some of it depends on the condition the collection is in. I think there are ways to do it. It's going to take a while, but it does depend if you're in a situation where you can print out location lists and do that, or if you've got a lot of unprocessed. One thing is that if you don't have that where you can just print out lists, then really narrow the scope of what you're doing. And it may be that if you've got a lot of those unprocessed, that you do start by just going, here's the number, here's where it is, this is the date I did it, and moving on. So there are ways to do it, but a lot of it is you reduce the scope and you try to get interns, you try to get a grant. There are different ways that you can deal with it. So if you're in that situation, I can give you more, but a lot of it will change the scope of what you're doing if it's just you.
Great. Okay, well, we are just about out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us. This session will be put on our CSAAM website, so a lot of those great graphs and forms that they shared will be available. If you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to any of the three of us. I think somebody did ask questions about grants that are available for inventories, and we can definitely share those links with you. And again, thank you so much, and join us for the next one.
Thank
Have a great
you.
day.
Thank you.